On a suffocating August night in the year 1737, in the royal stables of a forgotten palace in provincial France, something happened that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. What began as a secret whispered among servants transformed into one of the most shocking and disturbing scandals of European aristocracy. This is not a story of war or politics. It is a narrative about forbidden desire, obsession that crossed every line of morality, and a secret so obscure that it was buried under layers of official silence for more than 200 years. To this day, the records of this case remain locked in the Vatican archives, classified as documents that must never see the light of day. But some stories are too powerful to remain buried forever. Countess Marguerite de Valmont was born in the year 1715, daughter of one of the oldest and most respected families of French nobility. Her childhood was spent between the golden halls of Versailles and the family's rural property, a vast domain of vineyards and forests that stretched for leagues. From a very young age, Marguerite demonstrated characteristics that worried her family. She was beautiful, yes, extraordinarily beautiful, with hair black as night and piercing green eyes that made men lose their breath. But there was something more, something disturbing in her nature that her parents could never fully understand. She refused to play with other noble children, preferring to spend hours alone in the stables, observing the horses with an intensity that the stable hands found unsettling. When she was only 8 years old, she was found sleeping in the stall of a particularly temperamental black stallion, curled up against the animal that normally allowed no one to approach. The horse was calm, almost docile, as if recognizing in her something that humans could not see. As she grew, Margarite's obsession with horses intensified in ways her family considered inappropriate. For a young lady of high society, she insisted on training her own horses, refusing to use traditional ladies' saddles. She galloped across the property with a freedom that scandalized the neighbors, and she spent more time in the stables than in the drawing rooms, preferring the company of animals to that of people of her class. In the year 1732, when Marguerite turned 17, her parents arranged a marriage with Baron Henry de Montfort, a man 30 years older, wealthy but known for his cruelty. The wedding was celebrated with all the pomp expected of two noble families. But from the first night it was clear that the union would be disastrous. Henry was brutal, violent, and saw his young wife as property to be dominated. Marguerite endured 3 years of a marriage that left her with scars, both physical and emotional. It was during this dark period that she met Idal Noir, the Black Star. He was a purebred Arabian stallion that her husband had purchased for an absurd fortune, intending to use him as a stud to improve his line of racing horses. The animal was magnificent, with a black coat that shone like silk under the sunlight, perfect musculature, and intelligent eyes that seemed to see through people. But he was also considered untamable. 3 stable hands had already been injured trying to mount him. The Baron, in his arrogance, insisted he would eventually break the animal's spirit. Marguerite saw the horse for the first time on a spring morning in the year 1735. She had fled from the main house after another violent night with her husband, seeking refuge in the stables as she always did. When her eyes met those of Idal Noir, something passed between them. The stable hands who witnessed the moment would later describe it as supernatural, as if woman and animal had recognized something in each other that transcended normal understanding. Against all her husband's orders, Marguerite began visiting the stallion daily. At first, she simply stood outside the stall, speaking softly to him. Gradually, the horse allowed her to approach. After weeks, she was inside the stall, touching his muzzle, stroking his mane. The stable hands watched with growing amazement. The animal that had been so violent with everyone else was completely calm with the Countess. Within a few weeks, she was riding Idal Noir across the property, without saddle, without reins, only holding his mane while they galloped as if they were a single being. Witnesses described the sight as something out of a dream or nightmare, depending on perspective. The beautiful Countess with flowing black hair, mounted on the equally black stallion, moving with a synchronization that seemed impossible. The Baron was initially furious when he learned that his wife was riding the horse he had failed. to tame, but his rage transformed into something more sinister when he realized he could use Marguerite's ability for his own purposes. He began forcing her to exhibit Idal Neuer at social events, using the unique connection between his wife and the horse as a way to impress other nobles and potential buyers. It was during one of these exhibitions, in the summer of the year 1736, that everything began to change. A visiting Italian physician, known for his controversial studies on animal and human behavior, observed Marguerite with Idal Neuer and made a comment that would be repeated in whispers for the next months. He suggested that the connection between the Countess and the horse went beyond the natural, that there was something intimate, almost romantic, in the way she interacted with the animal. The comment was initially dismissed as the eccentricity of a foreign scholar, but it planted a seed of suspicion that began to grow. Servants began paying more attention to the long hours Marguerite spent in the stables. Coachmen noticed that she frequently visited Idal Neuer late at night when she thought everyone was asleep, and rumors began circulating about strange sounds coming from the stables during these nocturnal visits. In the autumn of that year, the Baron, always cruel and now consumed by a growing and morbid suspicion, began spying on his own wife. What he claimed to have witnessed on an October night would change everything. According to his later account, he saw his wife in the stables with Idal Neuer in a situation he described as unnatural and blasphemous. He never detailed exactly what he saw, but his implications were clear and shocking. What happened next was swift and brutal. The Baron, whether moved by genuine jealousy, moral repulsion, or simply seeing an opportunity to rid himself of a wife he could not control, took the case to ecclesiastical authorities. In a society where the church had enormous power over questions of morality, the accusations he made were of the gravest possible nature. Marguerite was arrested in November of the year 1736 and taken to a fortified convent where she would be held while awaiting investigation. Idal Neuer was immediately confiscated. The Baron demanded that the animal be destroyed, but the church, in its bureaucratic meticulousness, decided that the horse should be kept as evidence until the investigation was concluded. The investigation that followed was conducted with the absolute secrecy the church reserved for its most sensitive cases. 3 inquisitors were sent from Paris, men known for their discretion and lack of mercy. They interrogated dozens of witnesses, servants who worked in the stables, stable hands who had observed Marguerite with the horse, even other nobles who had visited the property. The testimonies were contradictory and frequently ambiguous. Some servants swore they had seen inappropriate behavior. Others insisted the Countess simply had a special gift with animals. A chambermaid testified to finding Marguerite's clothing with signs she interpreted as evidence of impure acts. An old stable hand swore he had seen the Countess on multiple occasions, in positions he described as to intimate with the stallion. But the most disturbing testimony came from a nun who had been assigned to watch Marguerite. After her arrest, she reported that the Countess, in moments of feverish delirium, spoke about her connection with Idal Neuer in terms that went beyond the platonic. She supposedly confessed feelings the nun described as romantic, and even erotic directed at the animal. She spoke about touching the horse in specific ways, about sensations she experienced in his presence, and about a type of union she insisted was purer and truer than anything she had experienced with human beings. Marguerite herself, when finally interrogated directly by the inquisitors in January of the year 1737, did not completely deny the accusations. Instead, she offered a defense that shocked even the experienced inquisitors with its frank nature. She admitted that she loved Idal Neuer, that she felt a connection with him that transcended any human relationship she had known. She described how the horse understood her in ways no person ever had, how his presence calmed her when nothing else could, how she felt complete only when she was with him. When questioned directly about whether she had crossed inappropriate physical lines, her response was purposefully ambiguous. She spoke about touching the horse, about sleeping beside him, about a type of intimacy she insisted was spiritual, but that her interrogators interpreted as physical. She refused to provide specific details, saying only that what she shared with Idal Neuer was sacred and could not be profaned by the limited understanding of men. This response, far from helping her, sealed her fate. For the inquisitors, trained in scholastic logic and rigid Christian morality, ambiguity was equivalent to confession. If she did not completely deny it, then she must be guilty. The fact that she defended her connection with the animal as something beautiful and pure only worsened the situation, suggesting she showed no adequate repentance for her sins. In March of the year 1737, the verdict was reached in secret. Marguerite was found guilty of acts against nature, of carnal sin with an animal, and of heresy for defending such acts as acceptable. The typical sentence for such crimes would be death at the stake. But Marguerite's family, still powerful despite the scandal, intervened with all the influence they possessed. An agreement was reached at the highest levels of the church and aristocracy. Marguerite would be spared from public execution, but would be officially declared dead. She would be perpetually imprisoned in a remote convent in the Alps, in a place so isolated it had no proper name, known only as the Convent of Eternal Silence. There she would spend the rest of her days in solitary confinement, forbidden to speak, to write, to have any contact with the outside world. As for Idal Neuer, the sentence was clear and immediate. The animal was declared cursed, a creature that had been an instrument of sin. In April of the year 1737, in a private ceremony attended only by church officials, the stallion was sacrificed. His body was burned completely, and his ashes were scattered on unconsecrated ground, denying even the animal proper rest. But the story does not end there. Official records were sealed, but fragments of information continued to leak through the years. Servants who had worked on the property told stories. Monks who had served at the convent whispered secrets. And slowly, over decades, a more complete narrative emerged. According to these fragmented accounts, Marguerite lived at the Convent of Eternal Silence for 28 years. She was housed in an isolated cell at the highest point of the structure, a tower where she remained completely alone, except for the silent visits of a nun who brought food once a day. She was not allowed to speak. She could not write. She had no books. She received no visitors. Her existence was reduced to the most basic form possible. But the nuns who watched over her reported strange phenomena. Marguerite, even years after Idal Neuer's death, seemed to be constantly conversing with someone invisible. She made gestures as if caressing something. She moved as if riding a horse that no one else could see. And occasionally, on the darkest nights, sounds resembling a stallion's whinny could be heard coming from her cell. Despite there being no animals for miles around, some monks interpreted this as evidence of continuing demonic possession. Others believed Marguerite had simply completely lost her sanity, but there were those who whispered a different explanation, that the connection between Marguerite and Idal Neuer had been so profound, it transcended even death, that somehow they remained united even through the veil that separates life and death. Marguerite died in the winter of the year 1765 at 50 years of age. She was found on the morning of a particularly cold day, lying on the stone floor of her cell in a position the nuns described as disturbing. She was on her side, with arms extended as if embracing something large, and her face had an expression of absolute peace that contrasted dramatically with the years of suffering she had endured. Stranger still, her body was warm to the touch, despite the cell being freezing and her having been dead for several hours. And around her, on the stone floor, there were marks that some swore were horse hoof prints, despite it being impossible for any animal to have climbed to that isolated tower. Her body was buried in unconsecrated ground, without headstone, without ceremony. The exact location was kept secret. All official records of her trial and incarceration were transferred to the Vatican's secret archives, where they remain to this day under the most restricted classifications. But the story of Margarite and Idal Neuer did not disappear completely. It persisted in fragments, in whispers, in local legends. In the region where the Baron's property was located, peasants told stories about a ghostly woman riding a black horse during full moon nights. Travelers passing through the area reported visions of a female figure galloping through the forests, always accompanied by a magnificent black stallion. Baron Henry de Montfort himself never fully recovered from the scandal. Although technically victorious in exposing and punishing his wife, he discovered that aristocratic society viewed him with suspicion and revulsion. After all, what kind of man was so inadequate as a husband that he drove his wife to seek comfort with an animal? He died alone and widely shunned in the year 1749. His family lying dying with him. The property where everything happened changed hands several times over the following centuries. The stables where Marguerite and Idle Noir spent so much time together were eventually destroyed, but subsequent owners always reported difficulties in keeping horses on the site. The animals became restless, refused to enter certain areas, and occasionally seemed to be reacting to something invisible. In the 19th century, an obsessed local historian managed to obtain access to some of the documents related to the case that had remained in provincial diocesan archives. He published a partial and heavily censored account in an obscure historical journal, but the article was quickly suppressed. Surviving copies are now extremely rare collector's items. What makes Margarite's story so deeply disturbing is not just the acts she was accused of committing, but the broader questions it raises about human nature, desire, and the limits of conventional understanding. Was she a desperate woman seeking escape from an abusive marriage through an unusual connection with an animal? Was it something deeper and more transgressive? Or was she simply a woman with a special gift for understanding horses, destroyed by a society that could not comprehend something outside its normal categories? The inquisitors of the time interpreted everything through the lens of sin and blasphemy, but reading the fragments of testimonies that survived, a more complex portrait emerges. Marguerite was not a villain trying to corrupt the natural order. She was a deeply traumatized woman who found comfort, understanding, and yes, a form of love, with a creature that did not judge her, did not hurt her, did not control her. The question of whether this connection crossed inappropriate physical lines will probably never be definitively answered. The evidence is ambiguous, the testimonies contradictory, and Marguerite herself refused to provide the clarity everyone demanded. Perhaps this is appropriate. Some secrets are too profound to be completely revealed. What is not ambiguous is the terrible fate that awaited women who challenged the norms of their time in any significant way. Marguerite was condemned not only for her supposed acts, but for her refusal to demonstrate appropriate shame, for her insistence that her connection with Idle Noir was something beautiful and sacred. Today, more than 280 years after her death, Margarite's story remains locked in the Church's most secret archives. Periodic requests from historians to access the complete documents of the case are routinely denied. The official reason is always the same: protection of the privacy of the parties involved and their descendants. But many suspect the true reason is that the case continues to be considered too shameful, too disturbing for public exposure, and perhaps, on some level, the guardians of these secrets are right. The story of Marguerite and Idle Noir is not comfortable. It challenges our moral categories, questions our assumptions about love and desire, and forces us to confront aspects of human nature we prefer not to examine too closely. But ignoring uncomfortable stories does not make them disappear. They persist in the shadows, whispered in low tones, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. Margarite's story is one of those narratives, scandal and tragedy intertwined, a dark reminder that the lines between love and obsession, between connection and transgression, are thinner and more easily crossed than we would like to admit. On silent nights, in places where the boundary between past and present seems thinner, some still swear they hear the distant sound of galloping hooves, accompanied by the laughter of a woman who finally found freedom. Truth or imagination, the legend persists, an ancient scandal that time has never managed to completely bury.